Every documentary tells you the same story. King Edward VIII, the man who gave up his throne for the woman he loved. The greatest royal romance of the 20th century. A sacrifice that shook the British Empire. But here's what those documentaries don't mention. Wallis Simpson kept writing to her ex-husband Ernest after the abdication. She wrote to him with warmth, with affection, with intimacy she never showed Edward. And in those letters, she and Ernest privately discussed and ridiculed what they called the king's childish behavior. The woman Edward gave up everything for? She never stopped loving the husband she'd left behind. This isn't a love story. This is the story of a man who abandoned his duty, his country, and his family for a woman who was playing him from the start. And the evidence has been sitting in private correspondence for decades. Let me show you the receipts. Edward was born on June 23, 1894, at White Lodge in Richmond Park. First son of the future King George V, heir to the largest empire in human history. And from the beginning, something was off. His father believed children should be afraid of their parents. He said so explicitly because he'd been afraid of his own father, and he saw no reason to break the pattern. Queen Mary, devoted wife that she was, maintained what Edward later described as an emotional distance that left him perpetually seeking affection he never got at home. This matters, because the man who would one day paralyze the British government over a woman he couldn't let go of was created in those cold nurseries. The emotional neediness, the desperate clinging, the inability to function without someone to fixate on. It all started there. So he looked for it elsewhere, and he found it in married women. Always married women. From 1918 to 1934, Edward carried on an affair with Freda Dudley Ward, the wife of a Liberal MP. 16 years. Then he moved on to Thelma Furness, American-born wife of Viscount Furness, from 1929 until 1934. There was overlap there. Edward liked having options. This pattern matters, because when Wallis Simpson enters the story, she's not some unique lightning bolt of destiny. She's the third married woman in a row. Edward had a type, and his type was unavailable. Wallis was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on June 19, 1896, in Pennsylvania. Her father died of tuberculosis when she was 5 months old. Her mother raised her on the charity of wealthier relatives, respectable enough, but always dependent, always aware of her precarious position. She learned early that security came through connections, through charm, through making yourself indispensable to people with money and status. She attended Oldfield School in Maryland, made her debut in Baltimore society in 1914, and then she made her first miscalculation. Her first marriage, to Navy aviator Earl Winfield Spencer in November 1916, ended in divorce by December 1927. Spencer was an alcoholic, allegedly abusive. They separated, reconciled, separated again. 11 years of misery before she finally escaped. But here's where it gets interesting. While waiting for that divorce to finalize, Wallis met Ernest Simpson in New York in 1927. Ernest was everything Spencer wasn't. Stable, British educated, Harvard man. Served in the Coldstream Guards during the First World War. Ran his father's shipping business. He was in the process of divorcing his first wife, Dorothea, when they met. He offered Wallis exactly what she'd never had: financial security, social standing, and genuine devotion. They married on July 21, 1928, at the Chelsea Register Office, set up a flat at Bryanston Court in Marylebone. By all contemporary accounts, the marriage was affectionate, comfortable, successful. Ernest adored her. She felt safe with him. For the first time in her adult life, Wallis had stability. So why did she leave him? She didn't plan to. Wallis met the Prince of Wales in January 1931 at a house party at Borough Court, the country home of Thelma Furness. The meeting was brief, apparently unmemorable to both of them. Neither recalled anything significant about the encounter later. For 3 years, the Simpsons were just occasional guests in the social circle around the prince, present because Thelma wanted them there, filling out dinner parties, making up numbers. Then, in January 1934, Thelma made a mistake. She left for New York and asked Wallis to look after the prince while she was gone. Look after him. By March 1934, when Thelma returned, Edward was obsessed. Not with Thelma anymore, with Wallis. And obsessed is the right word, the only word. He telephoned her multiple times daily. He couldn't be separated from her without visible distress. Courtiers noted how agitated he became when she wasn't present. He showered her with jewelry, including pieces from the royal collection that had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Alexandra. Royal heirlooms, given to a married woman who wasn't his wife. He arranged for the Simpsons to be included in every social engagement, every dinner, every weekend party, every cruise, every trip. Ernest Simpson found himself in an impossible position. His wife's new admirer was the heir to the British throne. The future King of England had decided he wanted Ernest's wife. What exactly was Ernest supposed to do? Challenge him to a duel? Complain to the authorities? This wasn't a rival he could confront. This was the man who would one day rule a quarter of the world's population. In August 1934, Edward invited the Simpsons on a cruise aboard Lord Moyne's yacht, Rosora, through the Mediterranean. Ernest didn't stay for the whole trip. He had business obligations, or at least that was the excuse. Photographs from that cruise, Edward and Wallis together, intimate, obvious, ran in American newspapers. The British press kept quiet. They'd agreed among themselves not to cover the prince's private life. But everyone who mattered knew. The palace knew. The government knew. Foreign diplomats were sending reports back to their capitals. King George V watched his heir's behavior with growing horror. Edward showed impatience with paperwork and official duties. He altered court protocols in ways perceived as disrespectful to tradition. He treated Wallis Simpson as his unofficial hostess at functions where she had no business being present. In November 1935, with his health failing, King George V told Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." 12 months. The old king knew his son. He just couldn't stop what was coming. He died at Sandringham on January 20th, 1936. Edward became King Edward VIII, 41 years old, unmarried. Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Emperor of India, ruler of dominions on every continent, and completely incapable of focusing on anything except the married American woman he refused to let go. Here's what the romantic version of this story leaves out. What the biographers didn't have access to for decades. What changes? Everything. Wallis Simpson kept writing to Ernest. She never stopped. And biographer Anne Seba, along with other researchers who examined this private correspondence, letters that Ernest kept for the rest of his life, letters that a confidant of Wallis also preserved, found something remarkable. The letters reveal a woman whose private sentiments directly contradicted the public narrative of overwhelming passion. In those documents, Wallis and Ernest discuss the king's childish behavior. Their word, childish. They shared observations about Edward that were dismissive rather than admiring. Not the words of a woman swept away by love. The words of two people watching a powerful man make a fool of himself. They ridiculed him. In writing. While he was tearing the empire apart for her. And Wallis wrote to Ernest with an emotional warmth and intimacy she never displayed toward the man who was dismantling his entire life for her sake. She never lost her affection for Ernest. Let that sink in for a moment. the greatest love story of the 20th century, and the woman at its center was still emotionally attached to her ex-husband, writing to him secretly, mocking the king who'd given up everything for her, treating the man who supposedly captivated her heart as a subject for private jokes. Ernest kept those letters until his death. He understood their significance. He knew what they proved. So if Wallis didn't love Edward, why did she go along with it? Because by the time she realized how far Edward would take this, she was trapped. She'd expected an affair, a dalliance. That's how these things worked in royal circles. The Prince of Wales had a mistress. Everyone knew it. Freda Dudley Ward had been his mistress for 16 years and remained married throughout. That was the arrangement. That was what Wallis thought she was signing up for. But Edward didn't want a mistress. He wanted a wife. He wanted marriage. He wanted total possession. And once he'd made that clear, Wallis found herself caught between her comfortable life with Ernest and the increasingly terrifying demands of a man who would not take no for an answer. The King of England had decided she would be his queen. What was she supposed to say? In the summer of 1936, Edward chartered the yacht Nolan for a cruise through the eastern Mediterranean. Wallis went with him. The party stopped in Yugoslavia, Greece, Turkey. Photographs showed them together in clearly intimate circumstances, on deck, at ports, in public spaces. The American and European press covered it extensively. The British press maintained its blackout, but the coverage abroad meant everyone internationally now knew the British king was conducting an open affair with a married American woman. And behind the scenes, the letters continued. Wallis to Ernest, Ernest preserving every one. In October 1936, Wallis Simpson's divorce petition against Ernest was heard at the Ipswich Assizes. Ernest had provided grounds by allowing himself to be caught at a hotel with a woman, a professional correspondent, not an actual mistress. A staged discovery. He was freeing Wallis because he understood she had no other option. The decree nisi would become absolute in April 1937. If Edward was still king by then, he could legally marry her. And that's when the constitutional crisis exploded. On November 16, 1936, Edward summoned Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to Buckingham Palace and dropped the bomb. He intended to marry Wallis Simpson once her divorce was finalized. He wanted to know how the government would respond. Baldwin explained the problem. Carefully. Completely. Edward was supreme governor of the Church of England. The church did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouses were still living. Wallis had two living ex-husbands, Earl Winfield Spencer and Ernest Simpson. Marriage to her would place the king in direct conflict with the institution he supposedly led. There was also the matter of public opinion. The British people had tolerated a discreet affair. They would not tolerate their king marrying a twice-divorced American woman of no particular distinction. The monarchy depended on moral authority. This marriage would destroy it. Edward proposed a solution: a morganatic marriage. Wallis would become his wife, but not his queen. She would hold some lesser title. Their children, if they had any, would not be in line for the throne. Baldwin said he would consult the cabinet and the Dominion prime ministers. Over the following days, the responses came back. From Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa. Every government whose sovereign was Edward VIII. The answer was unanimous. No. None would accept Wallis Simpson as queen. None would accept a morganatic marriage. None would accept any arrangement that legitimized this union. If Edward insisted on marrying this woman, he would have to give up the throne. The British cabinet concurred. Edward had three options: give up Wallis, give up the crown, or force a constitutional crisis that might bring down the government and shatter the empire. He chose option 2. But here's the detail that makes this genuinely pathetic rather than merely foolish. On December 7th, 1936, Wallis herself offered to withdraw. She had fled to Cannes to escape the press attention. From there, she issued a public statement declaring her willingness to withdraw from a situation that has been rendered both unhappy and untenable. Unhappy and untenable. Her exact words. She was giving him an exit. Take the crown. Let me go. Rule your empire. Save yourself. The woman he was destroying everything for was telling him to stop. Edward refused. He would not allow her to leave him, even when she tried, even when she begged. He told his advisers that abdication was preferable to life without her. Walter Monckton, the barrister who served as intermediary between Edward and the government, later wrote that the king's emotional state during this period was one of complete fixation, an inability to consider any outcome that involved separation from Wallis. 3 days after her statement, on December 10, 1936, Edward signed the Instrument of Abdication at Fort Belvedere in the presence of his 3 brothers, Albert, Duke of York, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent. All 3 witnessed the document. Parliament ratified it the next day through His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act, 1936. That evening, from Windsor Castle, he broadcast his farewell to the nation. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. The woman who didn't love him back. The woman who'd tried to escape. The woman who was still writing tender letters to her ex-husband while privately mocking the king's childish behavior. What did Edward actually give up that day? The throne of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the crowns of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the other dominions, the title of Emperor of India, ruler of 400 million people, the position of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, his income from the civil list, his official residences at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham, his place in the line of succession. Everything. Every title, every privilege, every responsibility for a woman playing him. On December 12, 1936, Edward left Britain for Austria. He wasn't allowed to marry Wallis until her divorce became absolute the following May. So he waited at Schloss Enzesfeld, guest of Baron Eugene de Rothschild, calling Wallis constantly, unable to function without hearing her voice. They married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in the Loire Valley, the home of French-American industrialist Charles Bedaux. No member of the British royal family attended. Not one. The Church of England refused to authorize the ceremony. A rogue clergyman, the Reverend Robert Anderson Jardine, performed it without his bishop's permission. On May 28, 1937, just days before the wedding, the new King George VI issued letters patent declaring that while Edward could keep the style of Royal Highness as Duke of Windsor, this dignity would not extend to his wife. Wallis would be Duchess of Windsor, but never Her Royal Highness. Edward never forgave this. He spent decades obsessing over it, demanding, complaining, writing letters, nursing the grievance like a wound that wouldn't heal. The man who'd given up an empire couldn't let go of 2 words. Wallis, meanwhile, had finally achieved what she'd never quite wanted. She was married to a man who could give her nothing but himself. No throne, no crown, no position. Just a title that came with an asterisk, and a husband who needed her more than she'd ever needed anything. And within 5 months of the wedding, they visited Hitler. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor spent 12 days touring Nazi Germany. The trip was arranged by Charles Bedaux, the same industrialist who'd hosted their wedding. The stated purpose was studying German housing and labor conditions. The actual effect was a propaganda triumph for the Third Reich. They visited factories where workers had been coached to greet them, housing projects designed to showcase Nazi efficiency, a training school of the SS. Throughout the tour, they were treated as visiting royalty, which, of course, was exactly the point. On October 22, 1937, Edward and Wallis were received by Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat at Berghof near Berchtesgaden. Photographs from the visit show Edward apparently giving a Nazi salute on at least one occasion. The German press ran the story for days. The former King of England had come to pay his respects. What better validation could the Nazi regime ask for? Documents captured after the war revealed this wasn't just a social gaffe. The Windsor Files, German Foreign Office archives seized by Allied forces, showed exactly how interested the Nazis were in Edward. Diplomatic dispatches from the 1930s recorded Edward's statements while he was still Prince of Wales. His admiration for German efficiency, his belief that Britain should seek accommodation with Hitler rather than confrontation. In 1936, German Ambassador Leopold von Husch reported that Edward had expressed sympathy for Germany's position and hostility toward the Foreign Office officials who opposed appeasement. The Germans didn't just think Edward was friendly, they thought he was useful, and they were about to prove it. In June 1940, France fell. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, and the Duke of Windsor, who had been serving an undistinguished military role in France, fled to Spain with Wallis. They were supposed to evacuate through a British ship. Instead, they lingered, first in Madrid, then in Lisbon. For weeks, while Britain fought for survival, the former King of England sat in neutral Portugal, making complaints about his luggage and his wife's title. And that's when German intelligence made their move. Operation Willy. The plan to bring the Duke of Windsor into the German orbit. Nazi agents approached intermediaries close to Edward. They suggested possibilities, a role in negotiated peace, perhaps even a return to the British throne of a Britain that had accepted German terms. The Duke would be valuable. The Duke would be rewarded. The Duke should consider his options. The German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, took personal interest in the operation. Walter Schellenberg, head of SS Foreign Intelligence, was dispatched to Portugal to oversee it. They didn't just hope Edward might cooperate. They had reason to believe he would. Documents captured after the war, statements attributed to the Duke by German agents, included criticisms of the Churchill government, defeatism about Britain's chances, suggestions that the war was unnecessary and that reasonable men could reach accommodation. Did Edward explicitly agree to collaborate? The evidence is ambiguous, but German intelligence believed he was approachable. They invested significant resources in cultivating him. They thought he was on their side. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, understood the danger. He needed Edward out of Europe, far from German influence, far from anyone who might use him. So he offered the Duke the governorship of the Bahamas, a position that sounded important, a position that meant nothing, a position on an island in the Atlantic where Edward could cause minimal damage. The Duke accepted. He and the Duchess arrived in Nassau on August 17, 1940. His tenure was unremarkable except for controversy. In 1943, Sir Harry Oakes, a wealthy mining magnate, was murdered in Nassau under mysterious circumstances. The Duke's handling of the investigation drew criticism. He brought in Miami detectives rather than Scotland Yard, and the case was bungled. The Duchess was investigated by the FBI for possible currency violations. British intelligence maintained surveillance on the couple throughout the war, still worried about security leaks and defeatist attitudes. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the man who'd replaced Edward was showing what leadership looked like. King George VI, Bertie, The stammering younger brother, who never wanted the throne, stayed in London throughout the Blitz. He and Queen Elizabeth refused offers to evacuate to Canada. They visited bombed neighborhoods. They talked to survivors. They shared the danger. On September 13th, 1940, Buckingham Palace itself was bombed. 9 bombs fell on the building while the King and Queen were in residence. They survived. The Queen's response became famous. She could now look the East End in the face. George VI met with Winston Churchill weekly throughout the war. Their relationship had begun awkwardly. George had preferred Lord Halifax as Prime Minister and resented Churchill's past support for Edward during the Abdication crisis. But it developed into genuine partnership. Churchill later wrote that the King's support had been invaluable during the darkest days of 1940, when invasion seemed imminent, and some in the government whispered about negotiation. George VI didn't waver. He backed Churchill completely. He embodied resolve. Edward would never have done this. The man who couldn't stand firm against his own emotions would never have stood firm against Hitler. The man who'd expressed sympathy for German positions would never have resisted pressure for peace. The man who'd visited Berghof and appeared to give Nazi salutes would not have been the symbol Britain needed. Britain didn't just survive the abdication. Britain was saved by it. Now here's the detail that ties everything together, the pattern that connects Edward's scandal to the present day. Camilla, Queen Consort to King Charles III, is the great-granddaughter of Alice Keppel. And Alice Keppel was the favorite mistress of King Edward VII, Charles's great-great-grandfather. The family tree runs like this. Alice Keppel bore a daughter, Sonia. Sonia married Roland Cubitt and bore a daughter, Rosalind. Rosalind married Major Bruce Shand and bore a daughter, Camilla. Alice Keppel conducted her affair with Edward VII from 1898 until his death in 1910. 12 years. She was so established in his life, so accepted, that she was summoned to his deathbed at Buckingham Palace. His actual wife, Queen Alexandra, allowed this. The mistress said goodbye alongside the Queen. A century later, the great-granddaughter of that mistress became Queen Consort. Think about that pattern for a moment. Edward VIII abdicated for a woman who didn't love him. His great-nephew Charles waited 35 years for a woman who did. The bloodline of the royal mistress finally reached the throne, not through scandal, not through abdication, but through patience, through time, through a man who didn't throw everything away the moment he wanted something. History has a sense of humor. Dark humor, but still. After the war ended, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor settled in France, a mansion in the Bois de Boulogne, leased from the city of Paris at nominal rent. A country property, the Moulin de la Tuileries, near Gif-sur-Yvette. They entertained guests, they traveled, they collected art and jewels, and Edward did nothing of significance for the rest of his life. He held no official position, performed no public duties, made no meaningful contribution to anything. He published his memoirs, A King's Story, in 1951, spinning the abdication as romantic tragedy rather than catastrophic self-indulgence. The book sold well. People wanted to believe in the love story. Mostly he golfed, gardened, attended parties, complained endlessly about his wife not being called Her Royal Highness, and waited for recognition from a family that wanted nothing to do with him. Queen Mary, his mother, refused to receive Wallis. She maintained that refusal until her death on March 24, 1953. She never forgave, never relented. She had watched her son abandon his duty, abandon his family, abandon everything she'd raised him to be. She would not legitimize the woman he'd done it for. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth, widow of George VI, maintained the same exclusion after Queen Mary died. She blamed Edward for her husband's early death. George VI died of lung cancer on February 6, 1952. He was 56 years old. He'd been a heavy smoker, yes, but the stress of a kingship he never wanted, forced upon him by his brother's selfishness, had broken his health. She never forgave Edward, never received Wallis, never pretended the wound had healed. Edward had given up everything for love, and he got nothing in return. Not from his family, not from his country, not from the woman he'd sacrificed it all for, the woman who'd kept writing to Ernest, who'd ridiculed the king's childish behaviour, who'd tried to escape and been dragged back. The Duke of Windsor died in Paris on May 28, 1972, of throat cancer. He was 77 years old. His body was flown to Britain and lay in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. More than 60,000 people filed past to pay respects. Queen Elizabeth II attended the funeral. The Duchess, visibly frail and disoriented, was received by the Queen and stayed at Buckingham Palace during her visit. The Duchess spent her remaining years in the Paris house, attended by staff, as her health and mental faculties declined. By the late 1970s, she was rarely seen. Visitors described a woman suffering from dementia, confined to bed, largely unaware of her surroundings. The sharp, calculating woman who'd navigated royal courts and social hierarchies was gone. What remained was a shell, waiting. She died on April 24, 1986, and here's how the story ends. The final grace note. Queen Elizabeth II made a decision. Despite everything, the abdication that traumatized her family, the burden placed on her father, the Nazi associations, the decades of resentment, the endless complaints about titles, she allowed Edward and Wallis to be buried together at Frogmore, in the grounds of Windsor Castle. Royal land. The private cemetery where generations of royals rest. She didn't have to do this. She could have left them in France. She could have separated them in death as they'd separated themselves from the family in life. No one would have blamed her. But she chose grace. The woman who stepped into the role Edward abandoned, the queen who reigned for 70 years, who never wavered, who made duty her life, showed more dignity in that single gesture than Edward managed in his entire abdication. She closed the wound. She let them rest together, not because they deserved it, but because she was bigger than the grudge, because spite would have diminished her more than it punished them. Edward VIII wasn't a romantic hero who sacrificed everything for love. He was a weak man who mistook obsession for love and abandoned his country for a woman who privately mocked him. Wallis Simpson wasn't a villainess. She was a calculating woman who got more than she bargained for and spent the rest of her life trapped in a prison she'd helped build. There's no tragedy here, just delusion, dressed up in crown jewels. The next time someone tells you about the greatest love story of the 20th century, ask them about the letters to Ernest, the ones where Wallis ridiculed the king's childish behavior while he was destroying an empire for her. Ask them why the woman Edward gave up everything for kept writing to the husband she actually loved. Then watch their face. If you want more stories like this, the real history, not the fairy tale, subscribe. Because the truth is always more interesting than the myth they sold you.